Hey, everyone, and welcome back. We've got a really interesting deep dive for you today.
Yeah, this one's packed.
So we're going to be taking a look at this recent interview that Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, gave to Lex Fridman.
Right, the American podcaster.
Yeah, I mean, this guy, Lex Fridman, he's had everyone on his show, from Elon Musk to, even former President Trump.
And it seems like Zelensky really opened up to him in this interview, shared some pretty personal views.
Yeah, and we're going to kind of unpack all that, his take on Putin and possible peace talks, and even this weird thing with Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, apologizing to Zelensky. It's wild.
There's a lot to dig into for sure.
Okay, so before we get into all the really juicy stuff, can we just quickly kind of set the scene here?
Yeah.
So Lex Fridman, he's actually got Ukrainian and Jewish heritage himself, and he speaks fluent Russian.
Yeah, he does.
So he was planning to do the whole interview with Zelensky in Russian, but Zelensky refused.
He did, yeah.
And that's kind of a big deal, right?
It is. It's really significant because, Putin has been pushing this whole one people propaganda, right? This idea that Russia and Ukraine are basically one nation.
Right.
So Zelensky insisting on speaking Ukrainian, it's like a direct challenge to that narrative.
It's like choosing a language is choosing a side almost.
Exactly. It's about asserting their distinct identity, showing that they're not just some extension of Russia.
Yeah.
Language is so powerful, especially in a conflict like this.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of powerful, Zelensky doesn't hold back when it comes to his opinions about Putin and the Russian people.
No, he doesn't.
He says he despises them both, blames them for framing this invasion as some kind of protection for Russian speakers.
Yeah, that's some pretty strong language.
Yeah. I mean, is that typical for a head of state, a world leader, to be saying stuff like that publicly?
It's definitely a departure from how Zelensky used to talk, before the war.
Right.
Remember, he was much more focused on finding common ground with Russia, trying to de-escalate the situation. So hearing this kind of strong language now, it's striking.
So is it just raw emotion? Or could it be a calculated strategy?
I think it's probably a bit of both. Expressing that anger, that contempt for the aggressor, it can be a way to rally people, both at home and internationally.
Yeah.
It paints a very clear picture. Ukraine is the victim, Russia is the bad guy.
And it's going to be hard, right?
Oh, absolutely.
To be leading your country through a war like this, witnessing all that suffering. I mean, I can only imagine the toll it takes.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Even though we see him as this strong leader. We can't forget he's a human being going through all of this on a personal level, too.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about peace talks, because Zelensky actually laid out how he would approach negotiations. And it's kind of strange.
It is interesting. Yeah.
He said he would talk to Trump first.
He did.
Then Europe. And then, and only then, consider talking to Putin. Why Trump? Why would Trump be at the top of his list?
It's strategic, I think.
Yeah.
Because even though Trump's not in office anymore, he still holds a lot of sway, especially within the Republican Party.
Right. Okay. So Zelensky's playing the American political game a little bit.
Exactly. By bringing Trump on board, he could put pressure on the current administration to maybe take a more active role in pushing for peace, or at least in influencing whatever deal ultimately gets made.
But wouldn't that be tricky with Europe? Because they haven't always seen eye to eye with Trump?
It could definitely complicate things. But it does show how Zelensky views Europe's role in all of this, more of a supporting one. He might see them as providing aid, security guarantees, but not necessarily leading the charge when it comes to negotiations.
So it's not just about ending the war, it's about shaping what comes after, making sure Ukraine has a strong position, on the world stage.
Absolutely, yeah. Every move he makes, every statement he gives, it's all part of this bigger strategy.
Okay, hold on to your hats, because this next part is where things get crazy.
Right.
Zelensky actually suggests using that $300 billion in frozen Russian assets to buy weapons from the U.S. He even pitched this to Trump directly.
He did.
So wait, he's saying buy American weapons with Russian money.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty bold.
It is audacious.
Yeah.
But it's also incredibly complicated. We're not talking about a simple transaction here.
Right.
There are massive legal and political hurdles to overcome to even consider something like this.
Yeah, because, those assets are frozen by a bunch of countries, not just the U.S., right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Unfreezing them would require international agreement, which is, unlikely, especially with how tense things are right now.
And wouldn't Russia just flip out? They'd say it's straight up theft.
Absolutely. They'd claim it violates international law, sets a dangerous precedent for other countries to start seizing assets in future conflicts.
So it's probably not going to happen.
Probably not.
But it is a pretty powerful statement, right? It forces everyone to think about how Russia should be held accountable for the damage that they've caused.
I see it as power play, yeah. He's acknowledging the immense cost of this war, demanding accountability. But, the West actually using those frozen assets, it opens up a whole can of worms, legally, politically.
Okay, well, what about Zelensky himself? What about his political future? I mean, he was pretty vague about running for re-election. He said it wasn't really the time to talk about it, with the war still going on.
Right.
He did say that elections could happen 90 days after the conflict ends.
Yeah.
But who knows when that will be?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Right.
He's being cautious, understandably so. Doesn't want to make any promises he might not be able to keep.
Right.
There's a lot of pressure on him domestically. As the war drags on, people are going to be looking more and more critically at his leadership.
But he's also become the symbol, right, of Ukrainian resilience. So if he does decide to run again, he might find he has a lot of support.
That's true.
Okay, get ready for this.
Yeah.
Because this next anecdote is like something out of a spy movie.
Okay.
So early in the war, Zelensky gets a call from Lukashenko, the Belarusian president.
Oh, wow.
And Lukashenko apologizes for those missiles that were launched from Belarus.
Really?
Yeah. He claims it was all Putin.
Wow. An apology from Lukashenko. That's not something you hear every day. What did he say exactly?
So apparently it was like an informal call. And Lukashenko basically said, hey, those missiles, those weren't me. It was Putin, I swear.
Oh, wow.
Zelensky even says there were witnesses to this conversation.
Huh.
So was Lukashenko being sincere? Was he genuinely trying to distance himself from Putin? Or is there something else going on here?
That's a good question. I mean, Lukashenko's in a tough spot, right?
Yeah.
We're very reliant on Putin, but he also knows that siding with Russia in this war, it's not exactly popular with his own people.
So maybe this apology was like his way of playing both sides.
Could be. Trying to show the West that he's not fully on board with the invasion while still staying in Putin's good graces.
But can we really trust anything Lukashenko says? What if Zelensky's, misremembering the conversation or exaggerating things?
It's possible. We do only have Zelensky's side of the story. And, memories can be fuzzy, especially in high-stress situations like a war.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we're dealing with different narratives here, multiple interpretations of events. We got to think critically about the information we're given.
Absolutely. We can't just accept any single account as the absolute truth, especially when it comes to geopolitics, where things are rarely black and white.
Okay, so beyond the content of the interview, I noticed something interesting about Zelensky's language. He keeps calling the situation in Ukraine an occupation, not a war, or a special military operation like the Russians do.
Yeah.
I mean, that's deliberate, right?
Very deliberate. By calling it an occupation, he's highlighting the illegitimacy of Russia's presence in Ukraine, emphasizing that they're an invading force, illegally occupying a sovereign nation.
And it taps into people's historical memory, too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Especially those who lived through Soviet occupation in Eastern Europe. It evokes images of, repression, resistance, that fight for freedom.
Exactly. It connects with this deep well of historical trauma and reinforces that narrative of Ukraine as a victim fighting for survival against an imperial power.
And that narrative has been incredibly effective, I think. Zelensky has been a master at rallying international support, and I bet his use of language plays a big role in that.
No doubt about it. He's a gifted communicator. He understands the power of language to shape people's perceptions, to mobilize action.
So remember Zelensky's bold idea about using those frozen Russian assets to buy American weapons? I want to put aside all the legal and political stuff for a minute and just think about the strategy here. Does it actually make sense from a military standpoint?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, on the surface, it seems like a win-win, right?
Right.
Ukraine gets the weapons they desperately need. The U.S. benefits from the arms sales.
Plus, there's that element of poetic justice, using Russia's own money against them.
Right. I see what you mean. But we also can't ignore the potential downsides. I mean, Russia wouldn't just sit back and let this happen. They'd likely retaliate, maybe by escalating the conflict or targeting Western interests somewhere else.
Yeah. And wouldn't it create a slippery slope?
It could.
I mean, what's to stop other countries from just seizing assets in future conflict?
Exactly. That's a valid concern. It could lead to a more unstable world. where financial warfare becomes, the norm.
So risky.
Risky move, yeah.
But with potentially big rewards.
Right. And ultimately, whether it's a risk worth taking, that's a political decision, not just a military one.
Zelensky talks a lot about victory, about ending the war, but I'm curious about his long-term vision for Ukraine. Like, what does that victory actually look like? What kind of future does he see for the country once the fighting stops?
Right. It's the big question.
Yeah.
And, he has talked about it, but mostly in broad strokes.
Yeah.
He's talked about wanting Ukraine to be a modern European democracy, a thriving nation that's fully integrated into the Western world.
That's incredibly ambitious, considering all the devastation they've suffered.
It's a huge undertaking, no question. But it's also a really powerful and inspiring vision.
Yeah.
It's not just about going back to how things were before the war. It's about building a new Ukraine, one that's stronger and more resilient.
But rebuilding takes resources. Right.
Right.
Massive resources. And that's not even taking into account the psychological scars this war has left on people.
It's true. It's going to be a long and difficult process. And they're going to need a lot of help.
Sustained international support. Zelensky's started laying the groundwork for reconstruction. But the scale of the task is just enormous.
And then there's Russia.
Right.
Even if the war ends, how can Ukraine guarantee its own safety?
Yeah.
Can they ever really trust Russia again?
That's the big question.
Right.
That's the heart of the security dilemma that Ukraine faces. Zelensky's talked about the need for strong security guarantees, maybe from NATO or a coalition of Western powers, to deter future Russian aggression.
But wouldn't that reignite that whole debate about NATO expansion?
Yeah.
Which was, one of the things that led to this war in the first place.
It would definitely be a point of contention in any future peace talks. Finding a solution that, balances Ukraine's security needs with Russia's concerns, it's going to be incredibly difficult.
Yeah. It feels like, kind of an impossible situation. But I have to say, I'm struck by Zelensky's optimism, He's seen so much suffering, yet he still seems to believe in a better future for Ukraine. It is remarkable. That resilience, that unwavering belief in his country's potential, it's one of the things that makes him such a compelling leader.
Okay, we've covered Zelensky's defiance, his strategy, his hopes for the future. But what about Zelensky the person? What kind of picture emerges from this interview?
Well, I think we see a man who's both, deeply human and incredibly strong. He's obviously carrying a huge weight on his shoulders, but we also see glimpses of his humor, warmth, even vulnerability.
Yeah, he doesn't come across as your typical, stuffy politician.
Right, not at all. He's charismatic, relatable, and he really knows how to connect with people on an emotional level.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of why he's been so successful in rallying support for Ukraine.
Do you think this interview will actually have any lasting impact, on the course of the conflict?
Hard to say for sure, but, I do think it's significant.
Okay.
For a few reasons. First, it gives us this unfiltered look into Zelensky's thoughts and feelings, which helps us understand his motivations, his decision-making.
It humanizes him, too.
It does, yeah. We see him not just as a wartime leader, but as a complex individual dealing with extraordinary circumstances.
And it puts his ideas and proposals out there, right?
Right, for everyone to consider. And that can shape the public debate, maybe even influence future policy decisions.
There was one part that really stuck with me. It was when Zelensky was talking about the period before the war. He seemed so, frustrated and angry about how the West, especially the U.S., handled things.
Right, when he was criticizing the Biden administration for not imposing tougher sanctions on Russia before the invasion.
Yeah, that's it. He argued that, if they had acted more decisively, it might have deterred Putin. And then he was also really disappointed about the lack of concrete security guarantees that Ukraine got under the Budapest Memorandum. So is he basically saying that the West abandoned Ukraine, when they needed them most?
I think there's a definite sense of betrayal in his words.
Yeah.
He feels like the West underestimated Putin and failed to protect Ukraine.
It's a good reminder that, even while a conflict is happening, there are always questions about what could have been done differently, the decisions that led us to this point.
And those questions are going to continue to be debated long after the fighting stops.
It's pretty incredible to think about how much Zelensky's life has changed in just the past year.
Oh, yeah.
He went from comedian and actor to leading his country through a war against a global superpower.
It's an extraordinary transformation. He's adapted to this challenge in ways that, I don't think anyone could have predicted.
And in doing so, he's become this symbol of hope and defiance for people all over the world.
Absolutely. He's shown that even against, seemingly impossible odds, courage and determination can make a difference.
All right, let's dive into another fascinating part of this interview, Zelensky's perspective on the Russian people.
Okay.
We've already talked about his strong words, that he despises them, but I want to explore why he feels that way.
Right. And it is a really complex and sensitive issue. I think it's important to understand where he's coming from. He's not expressing hatred towards individual Russians, but rather this sense of frustration and disappointment with what he perceives as their collective inaction and their complicity in Putin's aggression.
So he's saying that by not actively opposing the war, by not holding their leader accountable, the Russian people are basically complicit in the suffering that's being inflicted upon Ukraine.
I think that's a fair interpretation. He's conveying this profound disappointment, this anger at the lack of moral outrage that he sees within Russian society.
But, we can't forget that not all Russians support the war.
Right. Of course.
There have been protests, acts of dissent, even though they've been largely suppressed.
That's true, yeah. It's really crucial to avoid generalizations. Acknowledge that there are Russians who do oppose the war.
Right.
But Zelensky's perspective, it reflects that deep sense of hurt and betrayal he feels. And it really highlights the moral complexities of this whole conflict.
And it raises questions about the future, right?
It does.
Of Russian-Ukrainian relations. I mean, even if the war ends, how can those two nations ever really reconcile after such a traumatic experience?
That's a question that future generations are going to have to grapple with.
Yeah.
Healing the wounds of this conflict. It's going to take time, it's going to take empathy, and it's going to take a willingness to confront some very painful realities on both sides.
Despite all the darkness and tragedy, I'm still struck by Zelensky's optimism, his belief in the future, his commitment to rebuilding Ukraine. It's inspiring.
It is.
It really is.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit, it can be incredibly resilient. It has an amazing capacity for growth.
Okay, so we've delved into a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We've looked at Zelensky's strategic thinking, his vision for a future Ukraine, and even the complexities of his feelings towards Russia. But there's one more element of this interview that I want to explore with you. And that's Zelensky's use of profanity throughout this whole I mean, he doesn't shy away from strong language at all, especially when he's talking about the pre-war sanctions or the Budapest Memorandum.
Yeah, it is kind of striking to hear a head of state use that kind of language, especially in such a public setting.
Right.
But I think it speaks to the raw emotion that he's dealing with. He feels really betrayed by how Ukraine was treated, in the lead up to the invasion. Promises were broken and they were left vulnerable.
Yeah, it's like he's using those strong words to cut through all the diplomatic jargon, and just express his anger and disappointment directly. But do you think it hurts his credibility at all? I mean, is it appropriate for a world leader to be swearing in an interview like this?
It's a good question, and I think it really depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
Some people might find it unprofessional or, unpresidential, while others might see it as authentic, relatable, a sign that he's not afraid to speak his mind, honestly.
It definitely challenges our expectations of how a leader should act.
For sure, especially during a crisis.
Okay, well, we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive. We've explored Zelensky's defiance, his strategic thinking, his hopes for the future, his raw emotions, and even his use of language.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation.
It really has. So I know we touched on this earlier, but I keep coming back to this quote of Zelensky's legacy. If the war were to end tomorrow, how do you think he would be remembered?
It's tough to say for sure. Legacies are complicated, They're often shaped by time and hindsight. But I think it's safe to say that Zelensky's already cemented his place as a transformative figure in Ukrainian history.
And he's become a global icon, right? A symbol of resistance against tyranny, against aggression.
Absolutely. And win or lose, I think he's changed how the world sees Ukraine. He's shown us their resilience, their spirit, their determination to fight for their freedom. But beyond the symbolism, what about his actual leadership?
Right.
How will history judge his actions?
Well, there will be critiques.
Oh, of course.
I mean, there always are with any leader, especially during wartime. But I think, his accomplishments outweigh any missteps. I mean, he managed to unify his country when it mattered most, rally international support, and maintain morale in the face of, overwhelming odds.
It's pretty remarkable.
It is. He's proven to be a shrewd strategist. He's a gifted communicator, and he's a skilled diplomat. And those skills are going to be crucial as Ukraine faces this long and difficult task of, rebuilding.
He's going to need all of those skills, that's for sure. And more. The challenges ahead are immense, but if anyone can lead Ukraine through them, I think it might be Zelensky.
So if you had to sum it up, would you say he's more of a hero, a pragmatist?
Yeah.
Or something else?
I think he embodies aspects of both. There's a heroism in his unwavering commitment to his country, his willingness to stand up to a bully, and his refusal to give up hope.
Right.
But there's also a pragmatism in his approach to negotiations, his understanding of the limits of power, and his focus on what's truly best for his people.
Yeah.
In the long run.
Yeah. He's shown that he's willing to make those tough choices,
Yeah.
to compromise when necessary, and to put the well-being of his people above all else. And that, to me, is the mark of a truly effective leader.
Well said. Yeah. Someone who can inspire, who can strategize, who can adapt, and, make the best decisions, often in impossible situations.
I believe Zelensky's legacy will ultimately be defined by his ability to guide Ukraine through this crisis and help it emerge, stronger, more unified, and even more determined than before.
I agree.
We've explored so much in this deep dive. Zelensky's defiance, his audacity, the complexities of, geopolitics, and this enduring question of his legacy. But remember, this is just a starting point.
Yeah, it's one perspective.
It's one interview, one perspective on this incredibly complex situation. And it's still evolving.
Yeah.
This story is still unfolding, and the ending is far from written. But one thing is for sure, Volodymyr Zelensky has left a mark.
Yeah.
On the world stage. And his voice, his actions, they're going to continue to resonate for years to come.
I think so too.
So if you're as fascinated by this interview as we are, go check it out, listen for yourself, form your own opinions, explore different perspectives, and just keep learning about this pivotal moment in history, this deep dive. It was just a taste, a glimpse into, a whole world of insight.
Yeah, there's a lot more to discover.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and we'll see you on our next deep dive. But there's one more element of this interview that I want to explore, and it's the profanity. Zelensky's use of profanity throughout the interview. He doesn't hold back, especially when he's talking about, the sanctions before the war or the Budapest Memorandum.
It is striking, yet to hear a head of state use that kind of language,
Yeah.
especially in such a public setting.
Right. You don't really expect that.
They don't.
Yeah.
But I think it speaks to just the raw emotion he's dealing with.
Yeah.
He feels incredibly betrayed by how Ukraine was treated before the invasion.
Yeah.
Like promises were broken and they were left vulnerable.
It's like he's using those strong words to cut through all the diplomatic, careful language.
Right.
And just express how angry and disappointed he is,
Yeah.
directly. But do you think it hurts his credibility? I mean, is it really appropriate for a world leader to be swearing like this?
That's a really interesting question. And I don't know that there's an easy answer. It depends on who you ask, I guess.
Yeah.
Some people might be turned off by it, find it unprofessional or unpresidential. Others might see it as, authentic and relatable, a sign that he's being genuine.
Yeah. It definitely challenges our expectations of how a leader should act, right? Especially during a crisis.
For sure.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive. We talked about Zelensky's defiance, his strategies, his vision for the future, his raw emotions, and even his use of language, like we just talked about.
It's been quite a conversation.
It really has. So I know we talked about this a bit earlier, but I keep coming back to this question of Zelensky's legacy. I mean, if the war were to end, tomorrow, how do you think he would be remembered?
Legacies are really tricky things.
Yeah.
It's hard to say for sure. They're shaped by time and hindsight. But I think it's safe to say that Zelensky's already a really significant figure in Ukrainian history.
Yeah, he's a global icon at this point, right?
Yeah.
A symbol of resistance against tyranny.
Absolutely. And win or lose, I think he's really changed how the world sees Ukraine.
Yeah.
He's shown their resilience, their fighting spirit, their determination to be free.
But beyond just like the symbolism, what about his actual leadership, you know? His actions, how will history judge those?
I mean, there will be critiques, for sure.
Right.
There always are with any leader, especially during wartime.
Yeah.
But I think his accomplishments, they really outweigh any missteps. He unified his country when it mattered most. He rallied international support, and he's managed to, maintain morale despite facing overwhelming odds.
He's a really skilled leader, a shrewd strategist, a gifted communicator, and a good diplomat. And those skills are going to be so crucial as Ukraine starts to rebuild.
Yeah, he's going to need all those skills, that's for sure. And more. The challenges ahead are enormous.
Well,
but if anyone can lead Ukraine through them, I think it might just be Zelensky.
So if you had to sum it up, would you say he's more of a hero, a pragmatist, or something else entirely?
I think he's a bit of both. There's that heroism in his commitment to his country, his willingness to stand up to a bully, his refusal to give up hope. But there's also pragmatism there, in his approach to negotiations, his understanding of power, his focus on doing what's best for Ukrainians in the long run.
He's not afraid to make those tough choices. He compromises when he needs to, and he always seems to put the well-being of his people, above everything else. And that, to me, is like the definition of a truly effective leader.
Absolutely. Someone who can inspire, strategize, adapt, and make those tough decisions, even in the worst situations.
I think Zelensky's legacy, ultimately, it's going to be defined by his ability to guide Ukraine through this, through this whole crisis, and help it emerge, stronger, more unified, more determined. Well, we've explored a lot in this deep dive. Zelensky's defiance, his audacity, the complexities of this whole geopolitical situation and this big question of his legacy. But remember, this is just one interview. It's one perspective on a very complex situation. And it's still unfolding, right?
Yeah, definitely.
The story's not over yet. And who knows what the ending will be. But one thing's for sure. Volodymyr Zelensky has made his mark on the world.
Oh, absolutely.
And his voice, his actions, they're going to have an impact for years to come.
I think so, too.
So if you're as fascinated by this interview as we are, go find it. Listen to it for yourself. Form your own opinions, explore different perspectives, and just keep learning about this absolutely pivotal moment in history, this deep dive. It was really just a taste.
Yeah, there's a lot more to dig into.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.